That's right.
I'd like to invite those who are outside to make their way here so that we can start our afternoon session. I hope that everybody, this is fantastic to see so many people attending the afternoon panel after lunch. A lot of times they usually migrate. So we have panel 2 that I mentioned this morning, and it will be moderated by, which is an excellent panel. It's going to be moderated by the Vice Chairman and Treasurer of the Jerusalem Fund, my best friend, Dr. Eid Mustafa. His bio is not here. Everybody's bio is, but he, on about 48-hour notice, agreed to moderate instead of Dr. Gharib, who could not be here. Dr. Mustafa is a plastic surgeon who did his general surgery here in Washington, D.C. before going to do a fellowship in plastic surgery at Brown University. And then he relocated immediately to Wichita Falls, Texas. 1981, I believe, where he has been since leading a very successful plastic surgery practice. He's been with us here at the Jerusalem Fund since, I believe, 2003. Has done a very good job as treasurer and fundraising in Dallas, Texas. Now, he went to medical school in Alexandria, Egypt, and then served, I believe, about 3 years at Ramallah Hospital in Palestine before, of course, he is from Palestine, before he came to Washington, D.C. in 1976. I would not make this introduction lengthy. He has been here almost every year since 2003 and is with a familiar face to a lot of the folks who are here. So, Dr. Eid, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and I give him credit for my coming to Washington. He fixed me up, so otherwise I would still be somewhere in the Middle East. Thank you again. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the afternoon session, and I'm sure you'll find it very enlightening like the morning was. Remember your cell phones. We don't need any interesting music. The question and answers, the rules have been explained earlier. Many of you have been here. Questions, crisp, clear questions targeted to a specific panelist. Otherwise, I'll take them, and that will be a problem. For the people watching us online, they can reach us through, send their questions to @Palestine Center, and can follow us at the Twitter handle of #PalCenter19. I like the morning setup that Saeed started. The panelists have the option of coming to the podium or speaking from where they are, and I will introduce them as they get ready to speak. Our first panelist is Lara Friedman. She's the president of the Foundation for Middle Eastern Peace, with more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena. She is leading authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, specializing in the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the U.S. Congress. She is published widely in the U.S. and international press, and is regularly consulted by members of Congress and their staffs, by Washington-based diplomats, by policymakers in capitals around the world, and by journalists in the U.S. and abroad. In addition to her work at the FMEP, Lara is a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Middle East Project. Prior to that, she was the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now, and before that, she was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, serving in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. She holds a BA from the University of Arizona and a master's degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Lara will speak about media and Palestine. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, and thank you for that
far too long introduction. I was afraid we were going to talk about my first grade teacher and the topic of my 7th grade book report. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Palestine Center for inviting me and for having me as part of this conference. I, first of all, come to this with a great deal of humility. I am not Palestinian. And I'm speaking before an audience of people, many of whom are Palestinian, many of whom have been working on this issue even longer than I have. So I'd like to couch everything I say with the humility of knowing that we all know a lot about this and we all have very deep feelings. I also come to this with something of a, well, let's put me at something of a disadvantage because I've been asked to speak about media, which I will talk about. I'm generally on panels talking about U.S. foreign policy, settlements, Jerusalem. I'm a substance matter expert, a wonk. I'm not an analyst of media. So I'm going to be speaking, first of all, sort of topically and just giving you my impressions, which are the same. We all have impressions about this. And I'm also going to be speaking in such a way that I can talk about what I want to talk about, which is what we all are very good at doing. So with that in mind, I look at this as someone who's been a consumer of media on Israel-Palestine my entire life. And I am old enough to remember, and by the way, I am not a boomer, for those in the audience. I am the Gen X, where the generation nobody remembers exists. But I am old enough to remember when I, as someone studying Israel-Palestine, was constantly infuriated by the fact that there was not coverage of what was happening on the ground. There was topical things from an Israeli perspective. There was sort of what I could call the Hasbara stuff, but you didn't get coverage. I remember that. Fast forward to today, when I am every morning opening Twitter and opening the paper, and I'm infuriated, largely because I am reading what's happening. And I'm going to say that's an improvement in this situation. I'd rather be infuriated because the facts are terrible, and I'm reading them, and I can forward them to people, and I can analyze them, and I can document them, and I can write things about them, than the fact that the facts aren't getting out there, and I have impotent frustration that people don't know what's happening. So I think it's useful to start with a recognition that that is where we are today. There is an enormous amount of information out there. It is still enormously frustrating. It's frustrating to me. I had a direct message from a friend of mine who works on the ground in Israel-Palestine, who works with human rights and settlements and all that, with pictures of a Palestinian taxi driver who was driving in the West Bank and was hit by a rock, I think in the past 24 hours, that was thrown by apparently settlers, badly injured. It's getting no coverage in the Israeli press. Right? So I get that moment of just being infuriated that, stone throwing can kill people, absolutely. It doesn't seem to be necessarily as much of a deal depending on who's throwing them and who's being hit. So there's that constant tension, but that information is there. He's tweeting it out. I'm tweeting it out. I'm sending it to journalists saying, hey, look at what's happening. And we didn't have that in the past. And that is a significant shift. It wasn't that long ago when, I'm just thinking about this panel here, when, say, my colleague Yousef Munayyer would not have had a feature in Foreign Affairs, where he broke through a lot of the stale analysis and offered a very challenging and timely, lengthy, scholarly article, which has it's bounced far and wide, right, for people looking at this issue. It's not long ago when Yousef wouldn't have had that or wouldn't have had an op-ed in the New York Times. The space would not have been available to him as a platform. And it's not long ago when, in the midst of, say, a crisis on the ground, say a lot of Palestinians being shot along the fence in Gaza, that you would not have had Noura Erakat on cable news speaking, not just as a Palestinian saying, my feelings are hurt, this is painful, but speaking as an absolute subject matter expert with enormous authority. And by the way, her book is getting, great reviews. It's all over the place. It is changing the discourse. So there are these very strong positive things that I want to look at, or I want to at least highlight, because usually I'm famous for, I'm very fact-focused. I give a lot of facts, and the facts are really depressing, and people accuse me of being pessimistic, and I'm not pessimistic. I'm focused on facts. I also want to highlight some folks on the media side that you may not know about. You probably know about IMEU, right? Great organization pushing out a different narrative, amazing work. You may know about Shabaka. It's an organization that my organization funds. We love them. Shabaka actually highlighting, elevating, right? It's an incubator for voices offering a different perspective who are having an enormous reach, right? So if you look at Tarek Balkoni's book on Gaza, game changer. If you look at the articles that are being produced by on the situation for water or tourism, they're producing incredible stuff that is actually informing the discourse in a way that we didn't have in the past. I'd also highlight 972, which is the Israeli online magazine, which has Palestinian writers as well, and their sister publication, which is called Local Call, because 972 is the Israeli prefix for international calls. Local Call, which has both Israeli and Palestinian writers. So again, elevating, changing the discourse. That's awesome. The flip side is, I think, obvious, but let's talk about it. We still have problems of access. For anyone who hasn't been paying attention to what's happening on Twitter with Palestinian news services being suddenly, and there's always been a problem with this, but suddenly, apparently in line with what is supposedly going after voices of terrorist organizations, but you can really, you can define terrorist organizations narrowly or very widely. So we're seeing Palestinian voices quashed on Twitter, and Twitter today is for a large part of the world a primary source of news, if not the primary source of news. You have the same issue with the PA, right? So we woke up a couple weeks ago to find out that a whole bunch of Palestinian websites, Facebook pages had been quashed, and that's at the PA's request. It's very problematic. There's an organization on the ground called Hamla, which is based out of Haifa, I believe. They are working on internet censorship, access to information, all that, looking at both the Israelis and the Palestinians, both Israeli authorities and Palestinian authorities. And it's fantastic that there is a conscious effort to challenge this, but the fact that in 2019 we're still actually dealing with direct censorship issues is very problematic. That feeds into what I actually am most concerned about right now, which is as we talk about what is the pretext for censoring voices. And this is censorship in the classical sense and in the more broad sense of delegitimizing, deplatforming. And for me, what is happening right now that I think we all need to be very conscious of, I'm guessing people in this room already are, I often speak to a different part of the community that is not, is this increasing conflation. And so conflation has always been there, but it's got more energy today than it has certainly at any time in my lifetime. And it is the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, is a conflation of nonviolent, legal, peaceful boycott or any other kind of activism with anti-Semitism, and then you escalate very quickly to conflating with terror. And we are seeing this play out across the board. We're seeing this play out in, if you look at, for example, a number of NGOs that are working on Israel-Palestine, increasingly having a difficult time functioning because they are being deplatformed. They're being, it's called de-risking, so they're being pushed out of the banking sector. You see it with what happened on Twitter, where major news sources are pushed out ostensibly because someone says what I call the 6 degrees of terrorist contamination. You know, if you guys know the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon thing, right? You can always find, if you have 6 degrees, you can always find a connection. All right, if you talk about Palestinians, somebody who wants to shut down a voice or delegitimize a voice, whether they're talking about in the media or in social media or in the NGO space or in the political space, you play your 6 degrees of terrorist contamination. It's an enormously powerful weapon that I don't think people are effectively grappling with yet. And I think we're going to be grappling with it whether we want to or not, because it's coming home more and more. It's coming home in lawsuits against NGOs. It's coming home in campaigns against people. There was, last week, a lawfare organization wrote a letter to U.S. universities claiming that they were risking violating U.S. anti-terror laws because they were working with Al-Haq. Al-Haq being the preeminent human rights organization. And let's be clear, nobody, not even the people making the case, are arguing that Al-Haq funds, incites, supports, endorses anything with terror. What they're doing is saying, aha, we have used our 6 degrees of terrorist contamination, and now we are going to use that to shut down work which is actually trying to be democracy, pro-human rights, stabilizing all of that. It's the antithesis of actually supporting terror. And yet we found this hook because we believe that this narrative is so intolerable. And I think we're all, if anybody is waving on time, just let me know when I get close to time. The piece that I think in some ways is the most important in this room is that I talked about the conflation between criticism of Israel. I talked about and anti-Semitism, the conflation of activism and terrorism. We're reaching the point now, and you see this in the discourse around Israel-Palestine increasingly, is the argument that the Palestinian narrative itself is conflated with anti-Semitism. I am not Palestinian. The Nakba is not my narrative, all right? I grew up in a family where, critical in the same way of the world in general, but, Israel, 1948, miracle, all of that. As I've grown up, I've learned to grapple with the contradictions of that period, but that is my narrative and I will grapple with it. We are entering now a period, or maybe re-entering something that existed pre-Madrid, where even the existence, the articulation of a different narrative, a narrative that says that the creation of Israel was not a great miracle, or it didn't go well for the people on the ground, or the people who were there have claims, that narrative is increasingly being demonized in a way that I have not seen at any time really in my lifetime. And that, for me, is a cause of great concern. I will highlight one last thing, which is the IHRA definition. I don't know if folks are following this. If you don't know what that term stands for, this is the International Holocaust Remembrance thing. I forget the A stands for. Anybody? Association. It either sounds, yes, so it's an A. And the idea here is that there was, look, anti-Semitism is ramping up all over the world. Not a question about this. If you don't believe it, then you need to read the news and read about attacks on synagogues in this country and around the world, and attacks on Jews in Brooklyn and whatever. It is real and it is problematic. Some years back, an effort was launched to try to come up with a working definition of anti-Semitism to use predominantly in Europe to help people figure out how to deal with it. And this definition was largely crafted by a guy who worked at the American Jewish Committee, who is on the record back and forth and up and down saying this was never intended to be codified into law. Could not be clearer. This is a very problematic definition. It's a definition in law, or an effort to codify into law a definition of anti-Semitism, which effectively says that criticizing Israel can be and probably is anti-Semitic. And it codifies into law this idea that I work on Israel-Palestine. I don't work on the entire world. This is my area of expertise. But if I go up for a panel or write an article just criticizing Israel, that means by definition I'm anti-Semitic. I said to a friend of mine, it's sort of like saying you can either care about everything or you can care about nothing. And if you care about everything, it's going to have zero impact, so excellent. That's not how the world works. I said to another friend of mine, my father passed away not long ago from Alzheimer's. I am deeply concerned with Alzheimer's. I'm concerned with, I give money, I'm engaged with organizations. That does not mean I'm discriminating against every other disease out there that needs work. This is something I have a personal attachment to. But this argument that if you're focusing on Israel, it means you're anti-Semitic, has got enormous traction. And there has not been, I think, effective or sufficient pushback. Looking ahead, I am, on the one hand, very worried about all of these things and more. On the other hand, I actually am guardedly optimistic because the reins of control of information are not in the hands of anyone at this point, which, by the way, is also terrifying. We live in an alt-fact, alt-news world. That is very scary. But it also means it is not so easy to cut out information. So for me, when I was in college and couldn't find good information about what's happening on the ground in Israel-Palestine, or when I did find information, I would be accused of having, well, you've been brainwashed by pro-Palestinian sources and you can't believe this. All right, nobody can say that now. You can watch the video for yourself. If you think the video of soldiers shooting a guy in the back with a bullet that, yes, it's coated with rubber, so it's not going to kill him, it's just going to really, really hurt and possibly injure him, shooting him in the back as he walks away, if you can find a way to create a Hasbara narrative where that is not a problem, that speaks to you. But you're going to have to make that case before the world. The video is out there, and it can't be suppressed in a way that it could have before. And if you look at what's happening in the American grassroots, that is having an impact. It's having an impact on a generation which isn't looking for other people to tell them what to believe so much. They're looking at news, they're looking at information, and they're, I think, in some ways, overwhelmed with information, but at this point they expect to find it for themselves, right? They're not waiting for someone to digest it for them. And this is a generation that's looking and saying, we see people being shot in the United States without cause, we see people being shot in Gaza without cause. Explain to us how this is different. That's an incredibly powerful, powerful argument. And it's why I think you're seeing at this moment the people who want to shut down the free movement of information doubling down on this conflation because they are worried. And in a sense, they should be worried because the images are indefensible. The policies that are behind them cannot be put into a context which anyone will accept unless you are so inclined for ideological reasons. And the case is harder and harder to make. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Before I introduce the next speaker, I would like to remind you that we have a cultural exhibit. The calligraphy exhibit will open officially at 6 o'clock this evening, and you're all welcome. The artists will be with us for that. I don't think you can find better calligraphy anywhere. So with that, our next speaker will be Yousef Munayyer. We're used to Yousef standing here and introducing people, but life has a way of changing things. So Yousef is a political analyst and writer. He's executive director at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Prior to that, he was the executive director here at the Jerusalem Fund for several years and has also served as policy analyst for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. He frequently writes on matters of foreign policy in the Arab and Muslim world, civil rights, and civil liberties. He received his master's degree and PhD at the University of Maryland and has appeared on many outlets, media outlets in the United States. So with that, please help me welcome Yousef Munayyer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mustafa. I want to thank Mohammed for the invitation to come and join you at the conference here. It's always a pleasure to be back at the Jerusalem Fund. I've continued to follow the important work and programs of the organization, which continues to be a testament to the dedication of the board of directors and the fantastic staff here that I always enjoyed working with during the time that I was here. I have been asked to speak about BDS and the deal of the century. And you may wonder how these two things may be related. And I will get into that because I do think that there are important connections that are not often fully understood that are worth getting into. But I want to begin by talking a little bit about BDS first. I'm going to assume that there's a pretty good understanding of what BDS is here in this room. How many people know what BDS stands for? So BDS stands for, there's obviously a lot of people in this room know what BDS stands for, but also for the audience that is watching online, for anyone who may not be familiar, BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And we often are conditioned through the conversation about BDS into thinking about BDS as a movement, right? We often hear the word BDS movement. And I would like to offer something of a corrective towards that narrative and suggest that BDS is not a movement. The movement is for something, right? We had a movement in this country for civil rights. They used boycotts and divestment as well. Boycotts and divestment and sanctions, just as they were used in the civil rights movement and in the anti-apartheid movement, are a set of tactics that movements use for strategic reasons. And in 2005, there was a call put out by Palestinian civil society for those working for Palestinian rights to use the tactics of BDS, to use the tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Why is this important to understand? It's important to understand because boycotts, divestments, and sanctions are not the goal. They are a tool to get to the goal. And the tools that you use sometimes need to evolve over time. And why we may use one tool today may be different than why we use a tool tomorrow. But the conditions that led to Palestinians focusing on BDS, I think, are really important for us to understand because they have a lot to do with this conversation, how BDS relates to the deal of the century, and they have a lot to do with our understanding of where the movement for Palestinian rights is going to be going in the future. So why is it that Palestinians decided to move in the direction of BDS, Palestinian civil society. The reality is that, and I will tell you as a supporter of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, this is not the preferable route. This is not the preferable route for accountability for human rights abuses. The preferable route, right, in our international system, in our rules-based order, is that when states violate human rights, when states violate international agreements, when states are not treating those which they rule with respect and dignity, the international state system is supposed to hold those actors accountable. And there are tools and mechanisms in the international system which often have been broken, but nonetheless are supposed to exist to advance accountability. And for years, what we have seen in the case of Palestine is that when it comes to accountability for Israel, there is always an exception, constantly an exception. And the international state system has routinely failed in holding Israel accountable. And not only has it failed to hold Israel accountable, it's often and routinely enabled its worst abuses against Palestinians. So while this approach of boycott, divestments, and sanctions is led by civil society, I would really not want to see it fall on civil society actors to hold state actors accountable. It should fall on states to hold other states accountable. But because that has failed, and this is why this is so important, BDS has risen into the vacuum of demanding accountability. And accountability from civil society is a very, very different beast than accountability from the state system. And it requires a completely different form of leveraging power. It requires collective organizing, popular mobilization. Where do people get power from? They get power from each other. We do not have at our disposal the Treasury of the United States of America or other governments or militaries or the legal and diplomatic prowess to levy sanctions against other countries. But we have each other, we have our relationships with each other, we have our relationships with our communities and organizations, which together can create change in the spaces where we have influence, which is why you are seeing BDS campaigns succeeding in universities and succeeding as divestment initiatives in church congregations and so on. Where I think it's interesting to think about the moment that we're in and the deal of the century in particular as it relates to BDS, is that the state system, along with being very destructive towards Israel and Palestine, has also put forward this meta-narrative that has allowed it to do what it's doing, that has allowed it not to hold Israel accountable, and that is this meta-narrative of the peace process, right? And that meta-narrative is there are basically two sides here. They've been fighting forever. They're fighting over land. There's only one party that could really bring them together. It's the United States. And what has to happen is we need to bring them together around the table and peace can be made. And only the United States can do this, and the United States is an even-handed broker and so on and so forth, right? And, you know, over the years, presidential administrations have understood the value of maintaining this myth of even-handedness and needing to elevate this myth from time to time. And, 30 or so years ago, George H.W. Bush and then Secretary of State Baker understood that if they were going to pursue war in Iraq, if they were going to pursue war in the Middle East, it was going to be important for them to at least project this sense of even-handedness when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And the same thing was true of Bush the Younger when he went on his campaign in Iraq and decided to elevate the roadmap for peace and speak about a Palestinian state and so on. They understood the value of the myth of even-handedness. What has changed so much in this moment, and why I think it's so important for BDS and the movement for Palestinian rights and civil society accountability, is that that pretense doesn't even exist anymore. The Trump administration not only is no longer pretending to be even-handed, it's making very clear it doesn't want to be even-handed. Being even-handed is wrong, and being 100% pro-Israel and pro-Netanyahu and whatever the most right-wing forces in Israel and in the United States want is the only game in town. And what that's meant is that the people who were hiding behind the pretense of even-handedness, behind the pretense of the peace process, can no longer do so. And so what's left? what's left. We can no longer say we need to bring the parties to the table. We can no longer say the United States can be an effective mediator. We can no longer pretend that that path is possible. What remains is a path of accountability. What remains is the path that civil society organizations have been demanding for some time, whether that is through boycotts and divestments or through other methods that have been around before the boycott and divestment and sanctions movement as well. So the Trump administration, their deal of the century, their entire approach to Israel and Palestine has been a dropping of the curtain, a dropping of the mask that has allowed so many people to understand why it is that Palestinians for so long have been saying, we need accountability, we need Israel to be held accountable, and we need you, people in the United States, to stop waiting, and around the world, to stop waiting for your governments to do something that they're not going to do, right? And so in this moment, this meta-narrative has essentially fallen apart, and you are seeing what I think is a tremendous growth in demands for accountability, even if people don't necessarily want to call it BDS. The reality is, without BDS organizing, the conversation around accountability that's growing today in the United States, particularly among the left and liberals, would not have been possible. And so I think, you know, in many ways, we have a lot to thank President Trump for really showing us, what U.S. policy has been, and the fact that, you know, he's not going to pretend anymore about what it's all about. And so it's a clarifying moment for people who have been reluctant to get involved as civil society actors, and they're beginning to make their voices heard. I will add that a compounding factor here that both predates President Trump, but has also been really agitated and amplified by him, is this issue of a partisan divide today in U.S. opinion on the question of Israel and Palestine. And we are seeing that more pronounced today than ever before. All of the public opinion numbers that we look at on this question consistently show a wide gap between Republicans and Democrats on their views on this issue, whether it's when you ask about the question of general sympathy, whether it's when you ask about the question of what the U.S. position should be, whether it's on the question of BDS, whether it's on the question of how do you hold Israel accountable, can you use sanctions, and so on. The lines diverge very, very, very significantly. And you know, what this has meant is that for the first time, we can start having a conversation about the S. We can start having a conversation about sanctions. We can start having a conversation about government-level accountability for Israel's abuses. Boycotts and divestments take certain types of decision makers. People like you and I who are engaged in our communities at the university level, at the institutional level, and so on. The S, sanctions, that takes government-level decision makers. And what you are starting to see today is a conversation in places like Congress, in places like the presidential debate arena, right, as recently as last week, about how U.S. policy needs to shift in a direction of accountability, whether that's through conditioning aid, whether that's through you know, specifying that you know, the United States should not be sending any money to specific human rights abuses in Israel or beyond as well, but that includes the state of Israel. And we're seeing for the first time legislation in Congress that is beginning to call for that kind of accountability, like H.R. 2407, which is Betty McCollum's bill on the abuse of Palestinian children in Israeli military detention, and demanding that no U.S. money go to those abuses. For people who have been working on this issue for a very long time, and there are many of you in this room and on this panel, you know how revolutionary it is to be able to say that a bill like that exists today and that it is not political suicide for sponsoring it or co-sponsoring it. But the political space exists today to be able to do that, and one of the big projects that we have moving forward is to ensure that that political space grows. I want to say a word briefly on some of the challenges facing you know, the movement for Palestinian rights and the use of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think, as I said, you can see from the conversation from presidential candidates around military aid that the conversation really is changing. but at the same time, the challenges continue to exist. One of them is liberal Zionist anti-accountability politics. What do I mean by this? Groups that are still arguing that accountability is not the way that we should go, that we should stick to the old method, that we should revert to a peace process, that still it's the path of negotiation, not pressure, that's going to lead to some sort of agreed upon outcome between the parties. Groups like J Street, for example, who are not ready to get behind accountability at the congressional level, even though there is an energy today among a progressive base that is ready to push this forward. And there is more safety within public opinion for politicians to take these kinds of positions. This is a challenge that I think is a real roadblock for the moment in allowing this movement to generate that next level of momentum to propel it forward. Another challenge that I see is what can be called a potentially upcoming reset in U.S.-Israel relations. If you have a new presidential administration here in the United States, and if you have a new government in Israel that is not led by Benjamin Netanyahu, there will be many, many voices here in the United States who will say, well, now we have an opportunity to reset the relationship. Yes, Democrats might have had a problem with the hard right in Israel. They may have had a problem with Netanyahu, but that's changed now. There's a new government. Even if that government is no different in terms of its policies towards the Palestinians as the opposition to Netanyahu is, there will be voices here in the United States that are saying, okay, let's put those partisan divide issues, let's put that all behind us, let's reset the relationship. That is a major challenge that may be on the horizon, and it is imperative that we, in advocating about this issue, make very clear that a change in a figurehead at the head of the Israeli government that doesn't translate into a change in policy is no change at all. And we in the United States and those who care about human rights, those who care about international law and accountability should not be fooled by a change in figurehead if the policies remain the same. And a final word that I would say on challenges is continued state repression facing people who are doing this kind of work. Lara touched a little bit on the conflation of criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. She's done a tremendous amount of work in documenting the legislative efforts happening here in the United States and also internationally and beyond legislative as well that are attempting to make it illegal to engage in boycotts. And this is having a ripple effect around the world. The other day there was a story about the government of Australia putting forward legislation to make climate activism boycotts illegal in Australia. So this threat that has been posed to Palestinian rights activists is not a threat from states that is being contained to this one area, and it never would be, right? Now it's becoming a tool by powerful interests to really silence debate, just as we have long warned that would be the case in Western countries around the world. So I think we've seen a lot of people speak out against anti-BDS legislation, and I think there have been important victories there that we can point to, and we've seen a shift in public opinion as well on this. But this is going to continue to be a challenge, and what I can assure you is that as public opinion continues to shift here in the United States, as more and more people get involved, and especially as you see members of Congress begin to speak out about accountability, the Israeli state is going to think about new and additional and amplified ways in which to target activists doing this work in the United States and around the world. In closing, what I would say is that the next step is for us to redouble efforts in creating the kind of political space for accountability that we've begun to pry open today in some parts of the political spectrum, so that lawmakers across the spectrum, not just in the progressive space, but among liberals and moderates, and one day, even conservatives will have a conscience when it comes to Israel and Palestine and understand that Palestinian rights are human rights and deserve to be respected in the United States, should not be contributing to the abuse of them by the State of Israel. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Yousef. I admire your optimism. We need more of that. And I also learned throughout life that conscience and politics don't get along very well. They don't go along. Our next speaker is Grant Smith. He's the research director at the Washington, D.C. based Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy, founded in 2002. He manages research and education programs, including polling, Freedom of Information Act, filing, digital outreach, and conferences. He is the author of several books about the Israeli lobby, including Big Israel, How Israel's Lobby Moves America. He will be talking about confronting the deal from the U.S. perspective. Grant, please welcome him with me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me come here and talk about confronting the deal of the century. And we're going to start with that confrontational part. If these were normal times for the last year, we would have been subjected to a barrage of Gallup polling analysis saying what Yousef just said, that all indications are that Americans have great sympathy for Israelis when you ask them the following question. In the Middle East situation, are your sympathies more with the Israelis or more with the Palestinians? And as I was sleeping last night, I had a horrific nightmare that a child might actually download this presentation and see this chart of 30 years of Gallup polls indicating unequivocal majority American support for Israel and think that it was true. So I put a warning label on it to ward them away from thinking that. So confrontation, what has it meant in this case? The first step was, for my organization, looking at Gallup and Pew's data on essentially the same question. The organization Pew Research has had similar polls for year after year, indicating between 2001 and 2018 that Israelis and Palestinians, basically that public opinion was similar to Gallup, but that there was no majority sympathy for the Israelis, although it was close. And so the information has migrated out of these polls consistently. It's used in extremely important places. It's not only trumpeted by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and numerous newspapers to show year after year in March typically, which coincidentally is when AIPAC has its annual meeting, that Americans support Israel unequivocally, and it's used in the Congressional Research Service report by Jeremy Sharp that comes out every year to say essentially that Americans probably support massive foreign aid to Israel as well because, you know, they prefer Israelis to Palestinians when we look at the Gallup data. And so this poll has had extremely dangerous uses in places where it matters, including U.S. foreign aid to Israel. And so we began confronting Gallup in 2018, fielding their exact same polling formulation through the much more accurate Google Online Consumer Services in statistically significant polls. And what we found in 2018 is that, in fact, when asked, most Americans express no opinion when they're put to this question in the Middle East situation, are your sympathies more with the Israelis or more with the Palestinians? They say, I have no opinion on that matter. They don't say the Israelis. They don't say the Palestinians. They say, I have no opinion on that matter in statistically significant polls. Confrontation. We issued various reports saying, you know what? Gallup's data seems to overstate this whole sympathy thing. We don't think Americans do sympathize more with Israel. Gallup has some ancient techniques in phone polling and modal bias that we don't think it's accurate. And even the Jewish Daily Forward started worrying about the issue a week later, saying, oh, my, they do indeed differ somewhat. Confrontation. This year, We fielded the same question again, and guess what? The number of Americans who don't express, don't have an opinion on this matter, will not respond to this question increased. And so, what can we make of this? The bellwether, the number one polling device that for 30 years has been used knowingly and unknowingly by researchers, pundits, and lobbyists as a fundamental base of their argument that Americans support all sorts of policies foisted upon them that support Israelis over Palestinians is wrong. And there's also no need to ask Americans whether they support U.S. aid to Israel or not, because if you ask them whether they support it, most of them consistently, year after year since 2014, through the same Google Consumer Services polls, will say that they think it's either too much or much too much. Gallup doesn't poll on this specific question. Jeremy Sharp doesn't look for polls on this specific question. If anyone wants to Google it right now, public opinion on U.S. aid to Israel, at least the top 3 results will say, here's some quantitative, reliable polling data. You know what? Most Americans don't support it. So I did that for you too. March of this year, Confrontation, Gallup finally admitted that they were systematically biased, that they introduced a priming effect when they fielded their questions about sympathy for Israel in these polls. Basically, they said that when they asked country favorability, it tended to push people to later expressing opinions that they didn't really hold about Israel. And that when they did a test without the bias, that they found that people didn't actually sympathize with Israel. They didn't publish that poll. It was an internal thing. This admission was a back page item. AIPAC wasn't tearing down 30 years worth of polling data from Gallup the next day. So, but it was consequential. It was confrontation, putting the information out where it counts, challenging, and confronting. So, excuse me a minute. While I'm firing this back up, quick poll. How many people live in Virginia? How many people don't live in Virginia? And how many people don't know whether they live in Virginia or not? Okay, nobody. Excellent. Why am I asking that question? It's relevant, believe me. Oh, thanks, Mohammed. Beautiful. Okay, so Pew has stopped asking the question. They're transitioning and trying to disabuse themselves of their own data. But the important thing is this. This, I think, is why Mohammed talked to me about coming here today. There is a poll about the deal of the century that's been done. It wasn't done by Gallup. It wasn't done by Pew. And it's formulated in a way to put Americans in the positions of Palestinians. It decontextualizes entirely regional issues, whether you like Palestinians, whether you like Israelis, everything. And it simply asks, July 2019, after the economic part of the deal of the century was announced, if you were expelled and resettled into a resource-restricted area, would you fight to return? Or would you forfeit legal claims for a new life under a promised economic development plan? This is by the way, this is safe for home use, okay? 68% of Americans, this is the American perspective on the deal of the century, said that they would fight to return. So, fair question. Let's use the case study of Virginia now. Let's turn to Virginia. because it's kind of like a micro, I guess, case study of the economic plan of the deal of the century. Virginians have been kind of a test laboratory for a mini deal of the century since 1996. Because the Virginia state government, first in the governor's office, later in the legislature, has a deal of the century light organization of pro-Israeli political appointees who have been put there on the back of campaign contributions, mainly, they don't particularly have any qualifications, to do jobs and economic development. And the key assumption is they're going to do this with Israeli companies coming in because they're innovators that can succeed anywhere. And Virginia should feel pleased to have them. And they're going to do all sorts of beneficial MOU and economic development with the universities. This is called the Virginia-Israel Advisory Board. So this is their logo. I think this is interesting. It's probably the only state logo at this time with an Israeli flag on it. They're part of the Israeli government. They were created by the local Jewish federations, who also participate in the board of this state agency. Board membership are political players. They've given $1.5 million to put this thing together. They are on the long-term boards of directors, and the rest of the board is mainly drawn from local Israel advocacy organizations. So what's actually happened over time? The actual results of this deal of the century, sold to Virginians as economic prosperity, is massive ongoing predation and corruption of the state government. They've been looting the Tobacco Region Opportunity Fund. There has been cases of outright embezzlement. They're hiding the Israeli companies that they're bringing in. They are targeting local companies, such as Blue Ridge Aquaculture, for replacement with Israeli aquaculture companies. They're tapping Pentagon information, in the case of Orange Safety Glass, and then supplying out-of-spec products to the Department of Defense. They're skimming all the cream off the projects, distributing it to insiders, while basically giving non-existent milk to the rest of the Virginians. Some of the project names: Project Jonah, Project Turbine, Project Biodiesel. Why are they code-naming projects? Because they're bringing in Israeli settlement companies to open up companies in Virginia. Some of them are installing solar panels on the rooftops of public schools and state universities. I'm talking about Aloni Hetz and Energix. In some cases, they're open about it, Energix in the south of Virginia. In other cases, they're hiding, Aloni Hetz, in Arlington public schools. They're hiding behind limited liability companies because I think they would know that they would face resistance if anyone found out. An MOU with Virginia Tech, signed by Terry McAuliffe, has turned them into a marketing division of Strauss Group, Sabra Dipping Company. And this is an innovative Virginia university that has its own tech portfolio and research, but they're being turned into a marketing division. So it's been terrible for Virginia. It's going to increase their bilateral cumulative state deficit to over $7 billion by 2024. And Virginia state media is kind of useless on this issue. They only basically release the press releases from the Virginia Israel Advisory Board. The Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, though, has filled the gap and done some of their own public opinion polling. And here's what they found. When they asked adult voters in the state of Virginia whether they would like to continue supporting this deal of the century, the plurality, again, with this statement, since Virginia had a $500 million trade deficit with Israel in 2017, Virginia taxpayers should not continue to subsidize Israeli business projects in the Commonwealth. 38.1% said, yeah, we agree with that statement. So most of them don't know that they're supporting it, or didn't until the poll, but they agree that it's a bad investment. Their deal of the century is not that great. So basically, We have US public opinion. Americans wouldn't take the deal of the century. We have Virginia public opinion. They don't like their own deal of the century. But unfortunately, and this was alluded to by Max and some of the others this morning, they're just average citizens. And there's a wonderful study out about the actual impact by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page, the actual impact of public opinion by average unconnected individuals versus economic elites and interest groups, lobbies. And basically we're talking about they don't have a lot of impact towards change, not like that. So it doesn't really matter that most Virginians would want this out. And we did a little touch study, and this is all compiled in the book you see on the left, of a best case solution for a politician who wanted to go out with a Hold Israel Accountable campaign on a state level. And we found that out of about $90 million per year in campaign contributions, there was a $25 million committed pro-Israel campaign contribution pool and about a $13 million potential, hey, let's hold Israel accountable. But they're mostly unorganized and very hard to communicate with. And so the situation doesn't look good. Meanwhile, naming names, who is the special interest? Who are the economic elites on the other side who are behind, at very least, the concepts driving the deal of the century? Well, certainly AIPAC and the organizations on their side of the issue, which represent a nonprofit Israel affinity ecosystem in this country with 14,000 employees, 353,000 volunteers, and $6.3 billion in revenue, according to our compilation of IRS Form 990s. So they matter a lot in this issue. And AIPAC isn't out front very much about this. They're kind of in the background. But again, I preempted this morning, some of their think tankers are clearly in support of the political deal of the century. They want, in the last book by Dennis Ross and David Makovsky in AIPAC's think tank, they would like the US to accept Israeli annexation of settlements. They'd like them to further compensate Israeli settlers who are in remote compounds, bring them behind the green line or into newly annexed territories, and the US pays for that. That's what they would like. They'd like the US to pressure the Europeans, according to Ross and Makovsky, to agree to unilateral Israeli moves and increase, of course, defense aid to Israel. I mean, because why not? So the Israel lobby plan is clear. And so that would be the heavy hitters. And we can make a list of names for the economic elites who love this kind of thing, the interest groups, but there's no need for that. So I think in conclusion, I agree with what was said this morning. This is a lovely plan for the pro-Israel ecosystem. And if it doesn't come out under Donald Trump, under the branding deal of the century, it'll be reintroduced and relaunched at some time in the future. Whoa, did I put that up? In which we will get another chance to see what can be done about it. But backing up, I think it's important to remember that if we effectively confront some of the forces driving this in their vulnerable points, like Gallup. I mean, Gallup has done tremendous damage to this country. At the right time, with the right knowledge and the right tools, you can effectively confront some of this. You can actually do something about it. And once again, to give a shout out to VCHR, they are on the case of VIAB. They don't like their deal of the century. They want it to be gone. It's not a good deal for them. It won't be a good deal for the Palestinians. So with that, I think I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. So our last panelist is Abdel Razzaq Takriti. He is the inaugural holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Arab History at the University of Houston, and we are very proud of that. His research focuses on the history of revolutions, anti-colonialism, global intellectual currents, and state building in the modern Arab world. His book, Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, explores the history of the Dhofar Revolution in Oman, which was the longest-running major armed struggle in the history of the Arabian Peninsula. He also co-authored and co-edited with Professor Karman Abulsi the Palestinian Revolution website, offering bilingual online tools, analytical essays, and a wealth of primary resources on Palestinian history from 48 to 82 Siege of Beirut. His opinion pieces appeared in Arab Affairs, in a variety of English and Arabic and media outlets, including The Guardian, Al Jazeera, etc. He received his PhD or Doctor of Philosophy from St. Anthony College, Oxford, and his dissertation was awarded the Middle East Studies Association of North America's Malcolm Kerr Prize for the best dissertation in the humanities, and the British Society Middle Eastern Studies Leigh Douglas Memorial Prize for the best dissertation in the social science or the humanities. His most significant accomplishment is being a member of the Palestine Center Committee here. And he's going to talk to us about geopolitics and how it relates to Palestine. Dr. Takriti.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eid. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and an honor and pleasure to be the last speaker in this wonderful panel. And I've learned a lot from the other panelists, so thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. I've been asked to speak about the geopolitical shifts that took place in the Gulf region and that have resulted in some of the recent trends that influenced the deal of the century. Now, one of the aspects of this deal that we spoke about so much today, one of the most interesting aspects is the Gulf involvement in it. There's a huge amount of emphasis on that. There's a huge amount of emphasis in this deal on the normalization of Israel within the Gulf Arab state system in particular. In fact, I would argue that that's the main recent aspect to this deal. That's the main new thing about this deal. People have been talking about peace for economics for a long time. People have been talking about wide aspects of this deal, the destruction of the Jerusalem file for the Palestinians, turning it into an Israeli city, the destruction of the refugee file, the destruction of Palestinian solidarity through the sort of laws and discourses that we heard about earlier. But there is an aspect of this deal which is very practical, and that has to do with getting the Arab states to agree to that process and to go along with it. What is new about that is not the intent or the aspiration. What is new is the amount of involvement. The fact that you had the big economic conference taking place in Bahrain, for example. The fact that you've had pronouncements of a very public nature made by people like the current Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The fact that you've had a visit by an Israeli Prime Minister in a very public way to an Arab state, to Muscat in Oman. Now, what accounts for this situation? What accounts for this shift in, or seeming shift in Gulf policy? But also what accounts for this emphasis. And I want to start by saying that when it comes to the Israeli side and when it comes to the American side, this hope is not new. It's been there from the very beginning. The idea of getting the region to accept the establishment of a settler colonial project in Palestine started even before that settler colonial project began. Because you had discussions, if you look at the British discussions around the Balfour Declaration, the aspect of the imperial aspect was very important in these discussions, and there were people that were opposed to the declaration, certainly, used to regularly argue that this will be a problem for Britain. Britain is an empire. It has to manage lots of Arab lands. It has to manage Muslim lands. How is it going to deal with the anger that's going to result from a project of demographic transformation in this territory? Remember the Balfour Declaration, which is the cause of all what we see today, stated that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine, a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. So the purpose there was to alter the demographic of the space, to move a large population, Jewish population from Eastern Europe and other parts of Central Europe into this territory. And the byproduct of that, of course, is the logical byproduct of that is that they would either have to dominate the native population and turn them into a minority or a humiliated majority in their own land, or to expel them. There is no other option. And of course, we saw a combination of the two taking place. The discussions around that pointed out that there could be this imperial dimension. And of course, we saw that there were regular expressions of solidarity with the Palestinians across the region in all the areas that were dominated by Britain for a long time. On the popular level, this was never a popular policy. It was faced with a huge amount of resistance on the ground in the grassroots movements within all parts of the Arab world and within all parts of the Islamic world. From very early on, you had people like the Khilafat movement in India, Maulana Shaukat Ali and others from the 1930s. They were very strong on this question. They were very highly mobilized on it. The Palestinian leadership, of course, part of its attempt to struggle against the establishment against the establishment of this of the State of Israel in the 1930s and in the 1920s. Part of what they were doing was try to mobilize this sort of solidarity, and especially for those who know the history of this, they'll know that the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin Husseini, held a major conference in Jerusalem in 31 on this subject to try to get the attention of the whole Muslim world on this issue and to mobilize solidarity. So we have a long history of solidarity with this cause, and we don't need to rehearse it over and over again. The Gulf rulers themselves were also historically not sympathetic to the idea of demographic transformation in Palestine, but it's very important to understand their social location and their political location if we want to understand how their policies operated in relation to this question. All of these states were under the control of Britain. So it was a very complicated situation to be put in. If you are a ruler who derives their presence on the ground and who derives their power on the ground from an imperial patron, in this case Britain, but at the same time you disagree with a central aspect of that patron's policy in your regional neighborhood, that means that there is a contradiction, an element of contradiction in your relationship with this power. And we saw regularly the fact that these rulers consistently made it clear that they disagree with British policy towards the Palestine question, but at the same time were going along with the imperial authorities at the end of the day, because this is not going to be their number one priority. Their number one priority is political survival. So yes, they may disagree with the policy. They will actually fight against it. There is a myth that, it's always been a history of treason and they never cared about Palestinians and so on. That's actually not true. I mean, anybody that goes into the archives will see many protestations on the part of rulers across the region about this. But rulers across the region also care about themselves first and about their dynasties first. These are monarchical regimes. They're not republican regimes. They don't derive their power from popular sovereignty. If it was derived from popular sovereignty, we would not have ever the possibility of any state in the region ever accepting the expulsion of the Palestinian people from its homeland and the prevalence of a system based on a settler colonial state that governs through a combination of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and a whole range of racist policies. So the first instance, and this illustrates for us the complexities of the situation of a ruler, let's say, collaborating with Britain in a very clear sense on this was, of course, Sharif Faisal, before he became king. Okay, when he did his agreement with Wiseman, the Faisal-Wiseman memorandum, he was given the illusion in 1919 that Chaim Wiseman put him under the impression that, and of course some of the British officials that were trying to broker that agreement, put him under the impression that if you agree to the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, we'll give you the rest of the Arab world for you as a unified kingdom. So he was like, okay, you know, so he gave a very vague agreement or an understanding with Weizmann on that. Of course, he never got an independent Arab kingdom from the British, so that document never became relevant anyways, except that it was used by Zionist propagandists later on to say that, look, there was an Arab agreement for our project. Okay, and they used it very effectively in London to promote to their supporters and to those that were not supporting them in London that, look, this project is feasible. We can get somewhere. The Arab rulers, we can bring them to our side under the correct conditions. This will not be an impenetrable wall. And we see this happening over and over again. Of course, they achieved some successes with Faisal's brother, King Abdullah in Jordan, when he cooperated with them on the partition of Palestine. He believed that it was going to happen anyways, so he might as well take over the West Bank, you know. And there's of course, a huge literature on that now, and those that are interested can go back to, for example, Avi Shlaim's collusion across the Jordan, and it goes into great detail on this subject. But the Gulf rulers were far away from these kind of machinations. They didn't have borders at that stage, the 1930s, 40s, the Mandate period. The only ruler that had any political independence anyways was the ruler of Saudi Arabia, King Abdel Aziz. The rest could not control their foreign relations until independence, which in the case of Kuwait happened in 61. The rest of them got independence in 71. So throughout that period, the foreign relations of all the Gulf states were run by Britain anyway, so they didn't have control over this question in general. But the formula adopted by King Abdel Aziz in the 1930s set a precedence for them, and it shows us the dynamics that were going on. He was sympathetic to the Palestinians, of course. He was actually vehemently opposed to the Zionist project in Palestine, but at the same time, he very much adopted the realpolitik position that all Arab rulers like to adopt, and he saw this as an opportunity and as an arena in which he could project power in his relations with the outside world. So, and this became clear in 1936 when the Great Palestine Revolt happened, because of course, the British, when they needed to quiet down the Palestinian population, they found that they don't have any more direct avenues to this population. They exhausted all their political credit in the past 18 years, between 1918 and 1936. They had engaged the Palestinian leadership in negotiations throughout that period. That totally failed. So the whole population was up in arms. So their next potential avenue for pacifying the space politically was to rely on surrounding Arab rulers. They went to, of course, Prince Abdullah in Jordan, in Transjordan at the time, and they went to King Abdel Aziz in Saudi Arabia, and of course to the Imam of Yemen, and they all wrote a letter from the Arab kings saying that, calling upon the population to trust their interventions with our friend Great Britain, that's how the letter phrased it, and calling upon the population to retreat into quiet, and يخلدوا إلى السكينة. That is a specific formulation. Of course, people retreated into quiet, and then we ended up with a Peel Commission, which was a Zionist plan in the first place. It's a Zionist fantasy. It's telling the native population, oh, we'll give the majority of the land to the prime real estate in this territory to the recently arrived colonists, and you have to accept whatever pittance that remains for you, and you can set up a state there and will, of course, ethnically cleanse part of their population, because that plan had also clauses around transfer of Palestinians. So already, this is what the Arab role in that period yielded. But it's very important for us to know that that role did not come out of opposition to the Palestinian cause, as some people say. It came out of the position of these rulers in relation to the imperial project as a whole and in relation to empire. Okay? They are constrained and they have priorities. Their priorities are their dynastic and political survival. So we come to the period after the Nakba. After the Nakba, we had actually an intensification of sympathy on a popular level within the Gulf with Palestine, and that had to do with a variety of factors. One factor is that there were large Palestinian refugee populations that ended up in the Gulf. Another factor is that the Palestinian intellectual and cultural influence in the Gulf was huge, and it was influential even from the Mandate period. So to give you a simple example, in the 1930s, when the education system was set up in Kuwait by Kuwaiti civil society, because it was actually the Kuwaiti merchants that first set up the first elected education board there, they demanded that the first teachers be brought from Palestine. And this coincided with the 36 revolt, by the way. And they demanded that the Mufti of Jerusalem select those teachers. So we had the four Palestinian teachers were sent to Kuwait. They educated the whole first generation of educated Kuwaitis. These are people who ended up in foreign service. These are people that ended up in ministries. These are people that ended up across the Kuwaiti social sphere. They were heavily influenced by Palestinian ideas. Okay, and a lot of people in that space joined also parties that were founded by Palestinians or in which Palestinians had a big role. Parties like the Movement of Arab Nationalists. Parties even like whether it's the Communist Party or the Ba'ath Party or even the Muslim Brotherhood. All the political parties in this period used to be pan-Arab in nature, and all of them had a disproportionate Palestinian influence. The Palestinians were very important as theoreticians in these parties, as cadres, as activists. They wanted political change, and regardless of their political beliefs, they were active. And this meant that they had an avenue of influence through these pan-Arab or pan-Islamic movements across the region. So this is a very deep connection with a place like the Gulf. And it meant that overall the atmosphere was favorable for the Palestinians in this region, and governments tended to be in favor of the Palestinian cause. However, they operated within the parameters set up by the imperial sponsors of the region, which meant that when the two-state solution was being proposed after '67, most of these states took positions that were oriented towards that. They called it the moderate line. Most of them sponsored this line of moderation, which is the solution to this is through negotiations, and they were promising that the Americans would be honest brokers, and through their influence with the Americans, they'll be able to get somewhere. This was the role that certainly the Saudis were playing during this period. And Saudis in this period actually genuinely believed this, by the way. I don't have a reason to doubt that. Again, through archival research, it's not an evil plan to liquidate Palestine, but it is a reflection of their own politics, their own conservatism, their own outlook on the whole world, and their priorities around political survival, their positionality in relation to empire. And this has to do with them being a monarchical regime again. So if you look at places like Kuwait, which had a bigger active popular participation in politics, for example, their politics on Palestine tended to be more radical traditionally. Even now, by the way, there's a reason why Kuwait isn't that welcoming of the deal of the century, because they have an active parliament and there is a social movement on the ground, and on the popular level there's people mobilizing against this. If you listen to the speech of the Speaker of the Kuwaiti Parliament, it was a very strong speech in denunciation of this deal. So we can always rely on the people in this region, because there is this depth of relationship, this historic context that I spoke about. There is this history of these movements that were active there. There is this participation. The Dhofar Revolution, which I studied in Oman, was started by people who wanted to reverse the Nakba. They wanted to, basically, they were part of the movement of Arab nationalists, which was set up to reverse the Nakba. That was their dream. They used to say, we liberate the Gulf to liberate Palestine. So of course they had local demands, but they were also very interested in combating colonialism across the region. They were very interested in dismantling the entire settler colonial system. Nowadays, what we see in the news are the government heads and the people that represent those in power. But of course, on the popular level, there's a very different reality across the region. But like the rest of the region, there's no avenue for participation. There's no breathing space. There's no scope for people to express their demands for solidarity with Palestine or anywhere else for that matter. Because you get imprisoned, you get crushed if you do. So we have this problem. Now, when it comes to the recent transformations in the official positions of Saudis and others, they've moved from operating within the parameters of empire. They had an oppositional stance towards the Israelis, but within the parameters allowed by imperialism. Nowadays, the picture has shifted in a different direction, and this is a result of changing balance, the changing balance of power in the region. What we see, especially after the First and Second Gulf Wars, is a weakening of the position of these states in relation to their imperial sponsor. So if you look at the 1980s, the Americans were not the only player in the Gulf. They did not have as many bases as they do have now. They were, in fact, I'll give you an example. When the Iran-Iraq war happened, the Kuwaitis demanded joint Soviet and American protection of the oil tankers. They did not just go with the American route. After the first and the Gulf War, the first Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq later on, the American presence is the only presence in the region, and you only have basically within the Arab countries they're all in the American orbit. So that creates a very different relationship between the client states and the imperial sponsor. It weakens the position of the client states much more than ever before even. What they end up doing is they compete in a race to the bottom for who can win the greatest amount of favor in relation to this empire. And here the Israeli role becomes important. I'll give you one example that illustrates this, and then I'll end and we'll do question and answer. Why did Sultan Qaboos receive Netanyahu when he received him? The answer is actually has to do with a port, Duqm. It's a big project. Oman has serious financial problems. The oil is running out. The state is practically bankrupt. Certainly in the future it will be bankrupt. And initially, for many years, they had this understanding with Saudi Arabia that it would be good for Saudi Arabia to have a pathway to the Indian Ocean. And there was a whole project to develop Duqm as the main port of the region on the Indian Ocean. And the Saudis had funded actually highways inside Oman that would eventually connect to a highway in Saudi Arabia that would lead to the development of this project. Okay? But Saudi-Omani relations went through a serious crisis after MBS came to power because he wants Oman to clash with Iran. Okay? And he wants Oman to take a particular line in relation to Qatar. And he wants basically to position Saudi Arabia in the region in certain ways and to reposition everybody else in certain ways. And in many ways, by the way, he's weakened Saudi supremacy in relation to its neighbors through his policy, but that's a different subject. Omanis feel the pressure, and at the same time, they want to make sure that they get somewhere with this project. Now, the Saudis stopped construction of the highway on their part. There's no longer a linkage between. It's not gonna be linked to Saudi Arabia anytime soon. The Omanis need to find a way to get this project functioning, and they also need protection from the sort of Saudi bullying inside the Gulf that took place in relation to other small states like Qatar, for example. You know, so what do? They turn to they need the Americans for protection, but the Americans now demand the price. If you want to gain favor with the emperor, you need to have the emperor's assistant happy. You need to make him happy. You need to make the Israelis happy. Yeah, and the Israelis offer their services on this front. Gladly. And Netanyahu is very open about this because Netanyahu's own electoral platform inside the Israeli state is based on this idea that, you know what, I'm the only one that can get you, the Arab countries, to sign a peace with Israel through my relationship with Trump and so on. He promotes this openly. He says, that's why, by the way, they exaggerate sometimes the amount of relations they have with the Gulf Arab states. Of course, they do have relations, but Netanyahu exaggerates them even more because it's an important point for him. He gains credit with it. He tells them, I don't need to do anything with the Palestinians in order to gain favor with these guys. So Qaboos, who needs American sponsorship, he needs protection, American protection from the Saudis, and he needs American sponsorship for the Duqm project, which of course they did, because it hasn't been reported that widely in the news, but it's very important, by the way. Americans now have signed an agreement with Oman on Duqm, and that's significant because next door the Chinese have Gawdor, by the way, which is only a few kilometers away, and that's their own agreement with Pakistan. If you follow the geopolitics of this, it's an important space for the Americans, but it's also important for the Omanis to gain that. Just before the agreement was set, in order to reach the agreement, he needs to host Netanyahu. That's the price. Okay? And as we've said before, the priority for these rulers is their own survival. It's not the Palestinian cause. But at the same time, by the way, we shouldn't go along with all of these Israel lobbyists here that say a Palestinian cause is insignificant for them or for the Gulf. The Palestinian cause matters for some of them who have some connection to it. In the case of Qaboos, he doesn't, but he needs legitimation within Oman as well. So Palestinian cause is important for legitimation within the Gulf sphere. The argument, of course, that people like Qaboos used in their hosting of Netanyahu is to say, well, Mahmoud Abbas hosts Netanyahu, so what's the problem? Okay, so we have a problem on the Palestinian side in dealing with this question. The Gulf is not a lost arena. We have an immense history there, and an immense amount of political credit there, and an immense amount of popular support. Palestine is a consensus issue within Gulf society, regardless of what Gulf rulers do. They do have now some, Twitterati here and there that are on the payroll of governments that go and say anti-Palestinian things in the social media sphere. And then, of course, the Israeli lobby comes and aggrandizes that and says it's evidence of now, the Gulf becoming best buddies with Israel and all of that. But the fact of the matter is, Anybody that knows this society well and its history well will know that overwhelming support is with Palestine and will always be the case. But we cannot be lazy about that. We have to be active about it. And that means that Palestinian policy has to change. Palestinian attitudes to the region have to change. At the moment, Palestinian leadership has no active engagement there because it doesn't have a good policy in relation to the Palestinian cause itself. As we heard today from Professor Mas'ad and others, you know, if your own project is a project of collaboration and others go and collaborate, you're in a very difficult position, you know, telling them don't do it. Yeah? But the minute we change our policies, we can reactivate all the networks that we've had there for a long time in this region. And I think that the people will be with us there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abid, for shedding some light on a complicated situation. We jump to conclusions about the Gulf and start saying all kinds of things. So this is a question and answer session. I see the first hand come up here. I favor ladies, so anytime. We'll try to be fair, number two, but we'll try to be fair, both genders and locations here. Again, I repeat my plea to you to ask questions, not make lengthy statements. And with that, I'll give the first question to.
Thank you so much. The only statement is thank you so much for these valuable presentations. I learned a lot. This is a question for you. You didn't mention anything about the Saudi onslaught on Yemen, the genocide in Yemen. Where does that fit? Thank you.
One more question, and we'll have him answer. Yes, ma'am. We'll take two questions. We'll take two questions and then have him answer, and then we'll start after that.
Thank
on
you.
this
This
side.
question is for Dr. Takriti. You were very eloquent in talking about the affinity among Arab states for the Palestinian cause. Why is it then that only Jordan gives Palestinian citizenship? That's the first question. And the second, as an adjunct to that, is would it alter the impact in the area if that were reversed or if some of the other countries gave citizenship? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the Yemen question. The Saudi massacres in Yemen, and I can only call it a massacre when you have an air force bombing people on a regular basis, bombing schools, bombing roads, bombing a very poor population in this way. You know, that is a byproduct of the regional formula that I was alluding to, and of course there was no time to talk about it in any depth, let alone great depth. But you know, it all has to do, of course, with the way the U.S. destabilized the region through the occupation of Iraq, and through therefore creating this Saudi-Iranian clash, and of course then feeding it. And Israel comes into this clash, then you know you reorient the whole regional alliances around Israel by doing that, of course. And this, you know, this whole issue had to do with the way the Americans invaded Iraq. Iraq had always served a function in this region for at least 2 centuries, you know, since the British showed up. But I mean, much earlier, as a buffer zone between the Gulf side and the Iranian side. There's always been 3 traditional big powers in the region. There's the Iranians on one side, then there's whoever is in Iraq, for, you know, until the 19th century, the early 20th century, it was the Ottomans, of course, but later on it became the British and then the successive Iraqi administrations. And then you have Najd, which is a source of independent power in its own right, you know, through the tribal confederations there and what became the Saudi state. Yeah. So if you remove one important side of this geopolitical equation and you sectarianize that space, you create it, you call things by their sectarian name and you divide the country in that way, you augment a whole sectarian conflict in the region, you know. You will destabilize what's going on, and of course the Saudis have no good foreign policy, you know, set up. Even though you know, I wouldn't agree with their foreign policy regardless, because it would be geared towards the survival of monarchy, you know, and the survival of a system of economic exploitation geared towards, you know, dynastic enrichment. But even in that game, they're not very effective. Okay, and Americans knew that, and they've supported this because they're making money out of it. You know, they're getting a lot of money out of the weapons that the Saudis are buying. They're getting a lot of money, and Trump has been, again, very public about that. He's the first president to come out publicly and state the real objectives behind this. We saw his wonderful meeting with MBS, where he was pointing out to the posters, and MBS was idiotically smiling as Trump was showing people the price tags of the different weapons,
Right.
the different toys that this guy was going to be bombing and killing people with. So we have a very horrific situation. And of course, the Yemeni people are paying the price of this degeneration of regional politics. So yeah, and the Israelis are part of the equation, of course. It's all interconnected. So, and it's very sad. We can talk about Syria being also in many ways a byproduct of this, and we can talk about many other arenas, but that would require a different sort of session. The question of citizenship, look, I don't like these kind of questions. I mean, it's good that you asked it, but in American settings, they also mean something that requires this entanglement, because it becomes a question of, why don't they just resettle these refugees? And of course, that's not what you meant, but that's what that's audience reception is very important as well, and not just this audience, of course. In this society, that is what people think about. Is, well, you know, these people are there. Why don't they just take the citizenships of other states and that's it? Which, of course, was the American project in relation to Palestinian refugees from the very beginning. And Palestinian refugees were the people that fought against it, historically. So if you study the history of the early 1950s, especially in Palestinian refugee camps, you know, all the political slogans had to do with combating Tawtin. Yeah, I mean, they were even accusing Abdel Nasser of going along with American projects of Tawtin in Gaza. There were demonstrations in 53, you know, saying, I can't remember the slogan, but something, لا توطين ولا
I don't know what that is.
something, يا عملاء الأمريكان, yeah. You know, agents of, no توطين, no resettlement, or agents of the Americans, you know, this kind of line. So it's a complicated issue. But of course, there are different models. Palestinians have long demanded rights also in these countries, and they should receive rights in these countries. So there's two issues that have to be balanced here. One has to do with the Palestinian demand that the right of return not disappear, and the other one has to do with the Palestinian demand for a better life and better conditions for our refugees and our people everywhere. And that's always been the demand of Palestinian refugees, is that they want both. They're usually told it's one or the other. Yeah. Now in the Gulf, it's a different story, because they had a good economic situation, but of course they lacked political and civil rights there. So it's a yeah, I mean, I understand the emotion behind your question.
Very complicated situation. I have to make a couple of announcements, 3 maybe. One, we have calligraphy books for sale. This is the best thing you could have in your waiting area, and the best gift you give for Christmas. And the other one is, we have a phone for sale. It comes with credit cards. I'd like to open it for auctions here.
It's not for sale, sir.
So the third thing is, I want to warn you, Saeed is very tough at the State Department briefings. I hope he'll be gentle with you this time. So you have the mic,
I have
Saeed.
a very simple question, and it's to Lara. I mean, other than venting out on Twitter or the occasional article by you or Peter Beinart or someone like this, how can we combat the conflating of anti-Semitism with anti-Israeli? I mean, real steps forward where we can do that, delinking. Thank you.
So, very very briefly. I mean, I think a lot of that has to come from people like me. I think the onus on deconflicting these definitions needs to be from the American Jewish community first and foremost. I will say, you know, I engage a great deal with members of the Arab American and Palestinian American communities, and I am struck by how careful my colleagues and friends are to always differentiate between criticism of Israel and criticism of Jews. There is a generation, more than a generation, that I think has very much taken on board the realistic fears of Jews about anti-Semitism, and also I think understands pragmatically that the cause that they are trying to serve is not helped if you do not make that distinction very clear. So I'm not going to stand up here and preach to people that you have to do this. I think most people I engage are doing it very well. I think most of the onus on this falls on us. So. Look, just the one point I'll make, I think part of it is being aware and finding ways to articulate what is happening. I have spoken about this and written about this. We are in a moment in time when people who don't give a crap about anti-Semitism are claiming to be the standard bearers of fighting anti-Semitism so that they can use it to fight other causes. And this is where you find things like the folks who are using false claims of anti-Semitism to go after things like Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter showed sympathy and solidarity with Palestinians. Or you see the Women's March riven over, you know, false claims of anti-Semitism. These are people who do not care about anti-Semitism, who see it as a really valuable tool. The challenging part is that in parallel, anti-Semitism is rising. My community is more concerned than ever before, and it's not for nothing. Things are very scary. If I were a man who wears a kippah, in the same way that a woman wearing a hijab in some neighborhoods of this country, this is a difficult time. I don't think there's a simple solution for managing that, but I think it is calling it out constantly. I think that's incumbent upon all of us. And that isn't a matter of sort of exploiting intersectionality, saying, well, everything is about everything, but it's about saying you cannot allow legitimate concerns for anti-Semitism to be weaponized as a tool that makes people fight amongst themselves and undermine, you know, important causes that are plaguing this country right now.
Thank you very much. Please identify yourself and any affiliation you might have. The mic is yours.
Steve Lapham, and I'm with the Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East. And a great video about anti-Semitism is Jewish American David Zirin, Z-I-R-I-N, the sports editor of The Nation magazine. A little 5-minute video at notbackingdownumass.org. And it's a great 5-minute tutorial about how to counter that attack. But I had 2 quick questions I can say in pretty much 2 sentences for 2 panelists. Lara Friedman made the point about criminalizing any kind of connection with Palestinians or their cause. And Miko Peled was here last year. He wrote the book Injustice about the 5 Palestinian Americans in Texas who are political prisoners now. And my question, I'm not a lawyer, but is to, other than a presidential pardon, does anyone know of, you know, a legal counter to they're in prison now? And then my question for Grant Smith was that would it be wise for us all to go home to our counties, and go to your county budget on the web, and just search on the term Israel? Because last night I was at the Montgomery County budget hearing, and I asked the question, thank you for holding this forum early in the year on the budget. Last year we spent $40,000, no, not a lot, but for a county that's a lot, on the community grant to the American Israel Development Center. And Montgomery County should award our tax dollars to worthy local-based organizations. We should avoid conducting our own foreign policy. So as you were saying, all across the country, our counties are giving money to these little things, and Armatrain Technologies and ELTA, which is actually a part of the Israeli government, their military, is getting money from our county this year. And I don't think it's going to happen next year, because everybody was shaking their heads, how did this happen?
Let's give the panelists a chance to answer. Anybody care to answer? Grant,
Sure,
you're
yeah.
pointed there.
Yeah, so that's a great idea to confront your counties, but there's a problem. For example, Greenfield County, which is hosting Orange Safety Glass, the company that defrauded the Pentagon the minute it got a chance to, has given $1.5 million to bring Orange Safety Glass into their county, set it up, get it running, expand it. But doing extensive FOIA work with the administrators of Greenfield County, they are terrified to ask too many questions about whether any of their performance agreements in terms of employment, in terms of tax revenue generation, in terms of anything are actually being complied, because they have the Virginia-Israel Advisory Board hanging over their heads. The community colleges that are being asked to work on Israeli projects, they don't want to sign MOUs, but they're terrified their budgets are going to be impacted because they have an Israel lobbying organization inside their state government at the very center of power. So this goes far beyond standing up at a meeting in a county and raising these issues. Hey, why are we spending this money on this, on these crazy projects? So I of course recommend such confrontation, but it goes so much more deep. You really got to link up with the many Virginia-based human rights organizations that are on the ball doing meetings every week, drafting strategies, going to the assembly, and do something on a sustained basis, because this isn't going to go away. It's deepening. And I don't mean to compare the situation of Virginians to the horrific situation of Palestinians. That's not even reasonable. But there are some really interesting parallels that really could help raise awareness that I think have some long potential legs here.
We have 3 more questions in the back right there. 2, and Dr. Assad, and then we'll conclude. The mic, please, to the gentleman in the back right there. If you can't get to him, just throw it at him. Oh, well, I'm reminded there's a young lady there. We'll make him 4. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you so much. My name is Colette, and I'm a documentary filmmaker visiting from Chicago. And I was hoping to talk more about, in terms of media and film, the power of that to be able to change not only perspectives, but actual policies as well. And if you had any advice or had any remarks about around like social impact campaigns and like what sort of grassroots steps you feel are the most important that could be attached to like art and culture as well. Thank you.
You want a specific panelist for that, or any volunteers?
Sure. Make sure the frame moves around and get exciting people on. For our Israel Lobby Conference, we've gotten up to 750,000 views on a couple of them because people are coming in and making incredible statements about the situation, and people couldn't believe what they were saying. They're translating them from English to Arabic to Spanish, circulating them. So jump into something really controversial and just run the camera.
Excellent. The next question, please. We have to conclude this with the last 2 questions, and we'll give you a break after that. You've been a great, great, great audience. Please go ahead.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's Ghassan Boudiab from the Global Forum for Religions and Humanity. And I really enjoyed all the panelists. It was very informative. Coming from Lebanon and witnessing, you know, that major change and the civil movement in Lebanon invading the streets with the revolution of, you know, civil society, and trying to compare the situation between Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq, I would like to ask the panelists, what type or what trend of leaders do you think will be leading the Middle East in the coming future, given that the traditional school of leadership that, you know, is just only puppets for the foreign policies and has nothing to do with what the people want, is vanishing, and corruption destroyed the current system. So what trend of leaders do you think will be leading the Middle East? For that, do you think people like Marwan al-Barghouti would work again to be in position post-Abbas? Or we have to think about, you know, elite from outside the traditional establishment? Thank
Whoever can answer that with clarity will win the award today. Okay. Yep. Any volunteers again?
Do you want me to answer?
Anybody? Any
Okay.
volunteer?
Yeah, I think that the issue of leadership has actually the question. I would challenge the question. I think that's what requires changing. Is that we keep on talking about what kind of leader, but the real question we have to ask is what kind of system and what kind of movements do we have and what kind of parties do we have. The main shift that we see in the Arab world today is that there was a collapse of the party system and the system for organizing social movements and political movements in our region. For a long time, we had public intellectuals in the late 19th century. Then we had a shift towards more organized political parties for much of the 20th century. But for a variety of reasons that declined, and by the 1980s and 90s, we have an NGOization process taking place. So today, if you're someone who wants to create change in the region, it's very difficult to find an avenue for creating change or for popular participation in general, because the parties are too close to the state, okay, and at the same time, or are too weak. And then NGOs are NGOs. They're not representative of popular will. They're representative of a variety of agendas that tend to be top-bottom in their own particular way. So and often are what we call little dakakin. Okay, so we need something different that is outside the neoliberal order that created this context of the 1980s and 90s. And in the case of Palestine, that plays a major role in the perpetuation, of course, of the occupation structures. And we need something that rejuvenates the people. Now, inside the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, inside those parts of Palestine, there is a party structure, but it is no longer popular. Okay, it has major problems within it, especially inside the biggest movement in the West Bank, inside Fatah. It's a disastrous situation. Even the cadres of Fatah have no say in their own party. So we need a change in those structures. And in the case of Palestine, we need a change in the national structure as well, because the PLO has been hijacked. But any anti-colonial struggle requires a major structure that is organized. You know, whether you're in South Africa or whether you're in India or whether you're anywhere in the world, there's a formula for how to organize the people, or in Algeria. Okay, and you need a national umbrella movement that is representative of the people's demands, the people's anti-colonial demands. So how to reach that is the big question, not who's going to be the individual leader.
Very good. The last two questions, gentlemen in the back, and Asad, and we'll conclude because we're running out of time.
Mark
Our
Harrison.
live stream will cut off. Go ahead, please.
Mark Harrison with the United Methodist Church. Lara or Yousef on the U.S. media. When I was in Israel, Palestine, people know, the information I got was the U.S. media knows what's going on the ground, but they won't report it because they are get pushed back, and you may lose your job. The other piece that got raised, when I talked to one major U.S. newspaper here, the response I got was, all we would end up doing is repeating what's already going on the ground, so there's no need to report that. So I just want to say that. To Laura in particular, on the Israel population, the report that I received at a Council on Foreign Relations Committee, there's someone else who went to Israel, came back and said the Israeli population is okay, they're comfortable, so there's no need to change. And then lastly, what are your views on the Reconstructionists for them coming out on the HR 2401?
Thank you.
What changed?
Laura?
So very quickly, on the question of people reporting in Israel-Palestine, I know I talk to journalists. There's still pressure. The fact is, stuff is getting reported. Stuff is getting reported. It's certainly, I think all of us would want to see more. I don't think it's a matter of there isn't information in the press. How much there is, whether or not there is a false or an unfair focus on the humanity of one side. I always, the truism, Palestinians are numbers, Israelis have names, that sort of thing. That is still a problem. But, I think about work I do on Jerusalem, and you see like a major New York Times, a huge report on the wall that's being built in the Ma'ale Adumim bubble. You see, there's an enormous amount out there, and it does get there. Whether it should be on the front page every day or whether the right things are, I don't know. On the last part of your question, if you talk to Israelis, yes. The bottom line is Israelis, by and large, do not see this conflict. They don't. They see it when there are terrorist attacks, and you see what happens in this country. When people's views on something are driven by fear, they go to very bad places. And when there isn't that fear, then it's just apathy. Life is good. Israel's a great country. It's a great country if you're an Israeli. It's not a bad country if you're a non-Jewish Israeli. It's still a pretty great country. Which you see even with the nation state law, you don't see people like saying, oh gosh, we don't want to live here. You're saying that we want fairer treatment, but this is.
I'm not sure about that, Lara. Sorry, but
no.
I think Palestinians in 1948 would take issue with that statement.
So let me be clear.
I know, in fact.
So let me be clear. I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying Israelis. If you look at the agenda of the joint list, Israel-Palestine across the Green Line was a piece of it. Absolutely. What first and foremost got the enormous, incredible population to come out the way they did in this last election was the nation-state law, which is a law that dispossessed them of their rights as citizens. That's the first piece of it. It's absolutely tied into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the issues across the Green Line. There's no question. But first and foremost, it was pushing back and saying, how dare you pass a law that formalizes the dispossession we've been living all of these years as citizens, you hypocrites. Every conversation I've had with my friends who are part of that sector, they're very clear. That is the galling piece of it. It doesn't mean they're happy being second-class citizens, but that's the piece that came out. It's fighting on second-class citizens.
So they actually know the conflict because they serve in the army in the West Bank.
So
absent from their lives.
okay, so all right, so we can go into a whole separate debate very quickly. If you talk to most Israelis, if they serve in the West Bank, they do it briefly, they do it during their mandatory service, and they never look back. And that's when you're very young and you move on. The Israelis who look back, if they care about it, they care about it from an ideological perspective that they are absolutely in favor of. So you've got the pro-settler side of it, you've got the tiny human rights peace camp, and you've got everyone else who says, I don't want to think about this, I want to live my life. Who, by the way, are not unlike all the Americans who are saying, I'm unhappy that kids are in cages in my border right now. I'll tell you I don't like it, but I'm going to live my life. I'm not going there and putting myself on the front lines.
I think the only disagreement we have is around framework, which is that it's not a conflict. It's a colonizer, which means it goes. So it's not a conflict. It's the colonists and the colonized, and those that are colonized include the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So those that hold Israeli passports are colonized. It's not a great country for them to live. That was the only thing I was taking issue with. And it's very important for us to not think of it as a country even, to think of it as an ongoing settler colonization project. This
and
is
we'll stay like that until the issues are resolved in a just way. So we heard from analysts, journalists, historians, experts. The last question is to the psychiatrist in the room, Dr. Masri.
One thing you forgot to mention, you were very nice to UAE, forgetting that the Blackwater and Dahlan have accomplished billions of dollars and have manufacturing in Serbia.
Yes.
He happened to be a Serbian speaker and has a Serbian passport, and he has moved. and the idea, the people who know seem to know, it's revitalization of ISIS like between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And this is coming up, and it's a matter of time. So how can they be for Palestine? This is the question to you.
Yeah, I never said they were for Palestine. I think, but let me clarify.
Okay.
What I was saying is that the popular movements and the average person in the Gulf is for Palestine. Even if you scratch underneath the surface, if they say even some rubbish here and there about resentful stuff about the Palestinian people or something like that, if you go deep down inside, if there's and you see it when there's egregious Israeli crimes taking place, the popular feeling is different than government policy. Okay, it's not a particularly profound argument, but it's true. Now, when it comes to government policy, there has been a shift from the period of Sheikh Zayed, for example, who was following the old model that I referred to, which is, he's operating within the imperial parameters. He doesn't like what Israel is doing, okay, but he's not going to go and destroy his relationship with Britain and the United States over it. He will do certain things within those parameters to facilitate, for example, Palestinian employment, or he will even employ some Palestinians in his service, and not in a way oriented towards undermining the cause. Where they did undermine the cause historically, was in situations when they were clashing with pro-Palestinian forces in the region. For example, the clash with Nasser. Okay, that damaged the Palestinian cause, especially in 1967. Okay, but that clash was not. They were not clashing with Nasser because they're pro-Israel. They were clashing with Nasser because they didn't want Nasser to take over, to prop up the republic in Yemen and strengthen it, and therefore threaten their monarchical regime in Saudi Arabia. It's as simple as that. So it's not a defense of these Gulf rulers, but it was an attack on this line that you hear nowadays that says they're in love and enamored with Israel by default. That's not the case. Now the new ones, like MBS and MBZ, they're seeing that Israel can be beneficial, and Israeli relationships and relationships also with Palestinian characters like Dahlan that operate within the Israeli-sponsored / American-sponsored security constellation in the whole region. Okay, they see them of benefit for them, so they work with them, and that reinforces the point that I was making earlier. Which is it's the monarchical survival, dynastic survival, and personal. In the case of MBS, it's his personal ambition to reach power, as well. That is, he's willing to pay a higher price on this front than others. He's willing to go out there in ways that other princes would not. And you see this if you want to go into details. You compare his line with the line of someone like Turki al-Faisal. Okay, they're both operating within the parameters of the American empire, but Turkey. But Turkey went and said over and over again in interviews that, especially when MBS was increasing the push, say on Palestinians and pressuring the leadership to make more and more concessions, it was saying no, that Saudi Arabia sticks to the original Arab peace plan, etc. So that is the conservative traditional Saudi line. MBS line is the new line. It has to do with him positioning himself in relation to the empire as of being of better service than the old conservative leaderships. So, MBZ and MBS are playing this line. And all what I'm saying is it's important to understand the details of what they're engaging in.
To make you
Right.
laugh, Dahlan came to this country after he left the Israeli jail. He had no teeth. Salah al-Ta'mari took money from me to give him teeth.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's biting with it.
That's not fair. You got to take him back. Now, with that, we have to conclude. I thank you all for staying, and thank the panelists. Please give him a hand, and I'll turn the mic over to the chairman for his remarks.
thank you all. This has been an excellent, stellar day. I think that we've literally heard the history of the Palestine question. We heard the analysis of the deal of the century. But we also heard that there was a march today in Gaza where 70 people were injured. That goes back to my introduction of Dr. Mas'ad in one of the books he had written actually in 2006, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Essays on Zionism and the Palestinians. Subsequently, what started about half a century before 1948, we're talking about it in 2019 with 70 people being injured on the border between Gaza, which is a short border essentially, and the state of Israel. The deal of the century, my own prediction, will fail. As long as there is no fair solution, no just solution to the Palestine question and to the armless and harmless people of Palestine that were uprooted in 1947 and 1948, there will be no peace in the Middle East. And there will be, if there is no peace in the Middle East, there will be no peace in the world. I really would like to thank our keynote speaker. This was a fantastic keynote. As I told him, there was no fat, no gravy, just the meat. It was an excellent presentation. And to our panelists, the first panel and the second panel, I think that every one of them did an excellent job in fleshing the topic that was assigned to them, even though some of them were not necessarily their main forte or their main specialty. I think that the question has been approached from all of its aspects. But I would like very much to thank the staff of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center who have worked for the last several months in putting this event together, as they have done an excellent job every year, but they did an excellent job this year, and I hope to see every one of you also next year. Thank you.